And we're
Hey,
live.
going
Hey,
live.
David.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
Good to see
Happy
you.
to happy to be here in Zoom land in the portal. Talk about our books. So I guess I'm here to talk about this lovely book, Boy with a Problem, recently released by Pottersfield Press and authored by the one and only Chris Benjamin. So I'm going to start with a little reading from this piece, and what I want to pay attention to and what I'll ask you about afterwards is the use of dialogue in the collection, which is one of your excellent strengths, one of your main strengths throughout this book, I would say. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your approach to writing dialogue. But so that I thought it would be helpful if sort of the viewers could have a chance to listen to your dialogue a bit before we dive into that question. So I'm going to read from a story which is called Realities. And I'm going to read the first couple pages of this. I'm 27 and committing suicide the slow way when my older cousin Star finally arrives at my trailer. Star Boutlier, world traveler extraordinaire. She grew up in the next town, and to me she was always stellar, in the literal sense, something from the stars. A shooting solar eclipse. You got my message, she says, sunglasses propped on her poofy black hair. One tightly braided piece, dyed red, hangs over her dark face. I tried to call, I say. Oh, I had to change my number in every new country. Fucking SIM cards. How are you doing, darling? You just wake up? You look tired. I stand in the door, blocking her grand entrance. Surely it would be grand, and stare at her. I'm on acid. I aim to impress her with my daring. Acid in the early afternoon. Oh my. You're fucking kidding me. Who does acid? I haven't done acid since 1998. Can I come in? I stand aside. Her entrance is rushed. She grabs her bags, runs in, and drops them. Where's the toilet in this thing? I point down the hall and she runs, pisses with the door open. I half expect her to stand up. I turn away, but I can hear the flood and the flush in the faucets. It's Friday. The hit I took was my last until Monday. I wish I had more. You know Mrs. Cunningham is a dope dealer now? Mrs. Who? She shouts over the clicking of her high heels on the hallway's plastic stick-on tiles, which are supposed to look like ceramic. Cunningham. She shrugs. Nice to see you, by the way. You, filled out. Mrs. Cunningham, my old English teacher. Okay. I told you about her all the time when we were kids. She did literacy commercials. Oh, okay. And she sells drugs? Are you really on acid? Oh, all the time. Sounded cool about it. No big deal. She fixes her eyes on me. They're blue now. What happened to them? I put my finger as close to her left eye as I can without poking it. Contacts. She leans away. You're a junkie, Carrie? Geez, when in Rome, eh? I loved your green eyes. She stares at me, waits. You can't get addicted to LSD, Star. Yet you use it all the time. Yeah, like coffee. How else am I supposed to deal with this wasteland? Leave. I stare at her. She stares back. Does this tin can come with a bed, she says? I'm fucking beat. So that's the selection, some juicy tidbits of dialogue there. I hope I was pronouncing the last name right. I didn't know if it was like the Nova Scotian Boutlier.
All right.
People will correct you about it. I don't know how you're imagining it.
Boutelier.
Yeah. Could you please talk about dialogue and your use of dialogue in that piece?
Yeah, well, you read it super well, so that was fun to listen to for me. I think, I mean, I aim, I guess, for somewhat punchy, like fairly short, to the point, and because I think people tend to talk that way, and um, the mistake could be to write dialogue the way we think, or the way we write, in long extrapolations. And the trick, I mean, that's a first draft maybe, but good dialogue for me is in the editing. It's really like parsing it down, getting rid of the unnecessary, similar to poetry, which you write, I guess. Um, you know, verb heavy, not too many adjectives, probably just boom, and people swear and punctuate their points in colloquial ways. So there's a lot of that, and I mean, these two characters are cousins, so they know each other well, and they have a long history, so they can be very frank with each other in ways that not everybody could. So you do it differently, obviously, depending on the character. One writer once gave me the tip. He said, never answer a question directly. So if one character asks a question, that it should either be ignored or kind of answered in a roundabout way. Or so often in my dialogue, I end up having kind of two streams of conversation, even though it's only two characters and they're talking to each other. They're really talking about two different things. They're having two separate monologues going on. So one is trying to set herself as cool and impress the other one. And the star character, she's just like exhausted and after a long travel and trying to make sense of what she's seeing, like her cousin living in this trailer and talking about how she likes to do a lot of acid all the time and yet she's not addicted. So just trying to make sense of the situation, but probably is exhausted and just wants to crash. So I kind of like that device. I guess I use it a fair bit, just to show the two totally separate motivations of two different characters going on while they attempt to interact with one another in this new situation that they find themselves in. So that's, I guess, some general things I think about in dialogue, but again, it's all in the editing. It's like parse it down, parse it down, parse it down.
Right.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah. So the dialogue has a ton of energy, and that's one of the ways you get the energy. Do you want to just tell me about what it was like? Do you remember writing this particular scene, by the way? Because this is for me, this is a really bright scene in the book, like a really resonant scene in the book. I wonder, did it come out all in one piece or?
I think it did, that scene. Yeah. That story, I think I wrote in bits and pieces and came up with a few different scenes, and I rearranged it a number of times. I couldn't figure out the order, and you know, another writer who read it felt it needed more because he read it and wasn't sure what about Carrie, the main character, what was her journey about, and he could see her frustrations, but what was it all about in the end? So added bits and pieces here and there and rearranged things, but I think that scene was where I started and did end up being the beginning of the story, and I think that one did kind of flow out fairly natural. It probably shows, I mean, it usually does when a scene just comes to you and you write it, it often ends up being good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Not always.
it's very vivid, and the acid, the trailer, there's so much going on, and like you say, like all the different characters' motivations, it all comes on the page really well here. And then the peeing with the door open, also very, very vivid, and like who comes into your house and pees with the door open. It's just a very obnoxious, but at the same time endearing and intimate sort of gesture.
Yeah.
So yeah, you had me from the beginning at this story for sure.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And now I get to ask you questions about your book as well. This is Humanimus, which is a new collection of poetry by the great David Huebert, and it's Palimpsest Press is the publisher, and it's a fantastic book. So we agree we would try to segue nicely from question to question, but I can't really think of a segue from peeing with the door open to the question I want to ask. So I'm just going to ask it. This book deals a lot with themes of ecology, but also a lot of personal stuff in here. And it's a lot, I think, about how ecological crisis affects the individual's psyche. And what I really wondered, because I know one thing you and I have in common is we're both fathers. Your children are a little bit younger than mine, young enough that it made me wonder how having them become part of your life. And for me, having kids I thought a lot about the future of the world and what it meant to have kids. And I wondered if you thought about that as well, but also particularly how it affected the kind of poetry you write and how you go about writing poems.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's a fascinating question. I mean, I'll give you your segue, by the way. It's you never get to pee or poo with the door closed once you have kids, right?
Oh,
I mean,
so obvious. How did I miss that? That's a good one. It's so true.
Yeah, that's good material as well, right? Well, we're looking forward to when our kids grow up and maybe we get to close the bathroom door now and again. But it's a fascinating question. I mean, so the first way that affects my writing, having kids, yeah, I have one that's 1.5 and one that's 3.5, and it's been a wild ride the last 4 odd years. What the most obvious way it's affected my writing is pragmatically, um, which is that I can now I used to be very cloistered in my writing practice. That was I liked a very quiet, sacred-ish workspace, and that has been totally exploded. And I've become it's actually been great because I've become much more versatile as a writer. Like I can open a Word document with like a kid screaming in my ear and write a few notes and, try not to ignore them and try to get back to them. But I'm much better at tuning things out because I'm constantly surrounded by a tornado of childish chaos. Yeah. In terms of writing my actual poetry, well, one of the things that, I mean, children are poets. This is very fascinating, right? So one of the things that you do is just you talk to them, you listen to them, you engage, you get to engage with children's literature, which is like this whole fascinating imaginative realm that I don't know why we sort of leave that behind often as adults, because there's so much brilliant imaginative play in children's literature. So just reading stories to my kids, I find that very inspiring. Before, my theory about kids learning language, and most parents will have experienced this, most people who've been around little kids will have experienced this, is that kids learn language through play. So they learn language through, they love songs, right? They love songs. They're always testing the boundaries of language when that's one of the ways that they learn language, right? So they're actually poets in that way. They're not interested in an instrumental form of language, right? They can't understand it that way. They understand it through playing with it. Yeah, like I vividly remember, this is actually my niece, but she was flabbergasted that such a thing as a penis could exist, but not a punis, right? So these are the kind of stories you hear all the time when you have toddlers around, right? Another good one is an infant in my social circle was learning, their parents were hyping them up for potty training. And eventually, and they were talking about potty training, going to be doing potty training. And then eventually the kid had a breakdown when they actually started potty training because the kid was like, where are the trains? There's no trains in this potty training, right? So actually, this is a really interesting, this could segue me into mondegreens, which actually is something we can maybe talk about later. But something I do in the book a lot, in Humanimus a lot, is sonic play, playing with words. And one of the particularly sort of directed way that I play with words is through this mondegreen form, which is a deliberate mishearing. And children are mishearing things all the time. So in that way, they're giving you a lot of material. The other thing, Chris, the last thing I'll say about this is that they, and you know this, having kids, they just totally color every aspect of your life. And you can't, as you're saying, like you start to think about the future a lot. Yes, particularly when we were pregnant, but also when my kids were really little, I was thinking about the future, in a really sort of heavy way a lot, very often. And that was hard at times because, as we know, the future is very uncertain right now, and it can be a lot to think, can be very overbearing to think about where we're headed here. But also just like I watch a crappy movie now, a crappy sentimental movie with like a stereotypical plot, like a kid getting kidnapped, and it would not have affected me at all 5 years ago. And now I'm just weeping watching that, right? I'm helpless. So I'm much more sentimental and emotional when it comes to kids, but also just my whole world is colored by my relationship with my children, my awareness of how my children would perceive things and what would be good for my children. And so all of that will come out in my writing in various ways, a sort of radical empathy towards my children. I'm, if I start to write sort of about teenagers or anything like that, I'm sort of imagining my daughter in the future. So yeah, lots of different ways in which having children affects my writing. It's really heavy. So yeah, maybe I'll swing this back to you on this question of sort of the eco. and where I sort of was talking about there in terms of the future of our world, and the way that my children called into question the idea of the future and sort of all the precarious ecological concerns that we're facing in this great moment of ecological spasm. That's something that you address also, and you're also very concerned about in your stories. So I wonder about, I'm thinking about two particular stories that are about ecological action. One's called Mulch Glue and one's called Operation Niblet. And both of them have sort of ecologically oriented action meeting hijinks in sort of comical ways. And I'm wondering if you want to speak to your general ecological concerns in the book, your approach to ecological writing, and how you're dramatizing ecological action or environmental activism and what you're doing with it here in your fiction.
Thank you. I think with the short stories, everything for me really boils down to character. And I actually do a workshop for writers sometimes called Theme Equals Character, because I think some writers, not all of them, are like us in that they have big ideas or things they think about or worry about or that concern them, and they want to turn that into either fiction or poetry or what have you. But with fiction particularly, the struggle becomes, how do you do that without being didactic? Because nobody likes to be preached to in fiction. It's not enjoyable to read. I think people are tolerant of it in an essay or whatever. I mean, that's the point of an essay, is to be argumentative, but in fiction, it just rings false and makes the characters feel inauthentic, and it makes for a dry read often, and you lose readers. So my workshop makes the point that you correct this by making believable, interesting characters who maybe believe the things you do, or maybe are the antithesis of that, or what have you, but in some way illustrate the point you have in your mind. And when you play with that, it doesn't necessarily come out the way you intended, because characters will take you where they want sometimes. And I think that happened in both of those stories you mentioned. Is, I had a flawed character, because humans are flawed, who had really good intentions one way or the other, but the best laid plans, sometimes the not so great laid plans, run into the kind of follies you're talking about, which I think is somewhat representative of the reality of the entire environmental movement, which I have been part of for much of my life. But it's, there's no clear mission plan. There was a big kind of movement a few years ago, pointing out that the environmental movement lacked its "I Had a Dream" speech from the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King, that kind of galvanizing, this is what we're fighting for. So everybody seems to know what they're fighting against, but what are they fighting for? What is the vision? And I think that's what's illustrated in those two stories. And one features a young woman who's fighting against a mill that has made an ecological mess of her town, and destroyed it. And she takes a stand, but it's a bit of a rash stand, and not necessarily well thought out. It's inspired by people online, who some of whom have done similar things, but her biggest flaw, I think, is that she does it herself. She doesn't connect with a community of support, and I think that's something I can see a young person in a small town doing, who has a belief, in her case, that is running up against the whole town, because the whole town depends on that mill for their economic survival, which is, again, that's very much a reality that we see in the world, is economics takes on ecology. And I personally believe there is a way that you can have both. And in fact, I think it's pretty clear that you can have a vibrant economy that is far more sustainable. And it's just there's certain vested interests that prevent that. But maybe she's young in her enviro activism career, and she takes on the mill herself, which is doomed from the outset. But hopefully that's something she learns if there's a sequel version of her, maybe that's something she's learned in that. And the other young man, um, he attacks a vivisection lab, but he does it out of love for a girl. He's trying to impress a young woman who's um, very ecologically minded, much more so than him. And he's also just learning, but maybe that's his initial exposure to these ideas. So I chose flawed characters, I guess, to illustrate the difficulty and those challenges. But even the absolute best minds of the environmental movement struggle with this, I think, of how to be effective, how to change people's point of view, how to change the economy. And even when they realize philosophically how they'd like to see it done, there's the political reality that they run into time and time again. So that's I guess my technique is to embody whatever themes I see into characters, into human characters that I hope are believable and struggle with the same ideas. Yeah. So that one segues nicely into my question for you, because your work is so much about ideas. I felt reading your poetry really reinforced my idea that one can educate themselves by reading fiction and poetry. And I don't just mean it changes your way of thinking, but I actually learned things about Beethoven and all kinds of new biological terms and concepts, some of which I had to look up, which I learned a lot from. And your use of wordplay throughout is, as you mentioned, wordplay. It's amazing, and how you use scientific, what I would call jargon, I guess, but basically scientific terms, and you play with them in a fun and rhythmic way, and you use a lot of different poetic forms. And I'm actually going to read one of my favorite poems because I think it well illustrates what I'm getting at, which is that your poetry is really, really smart, but at the same time, really, really emotional and personal. So this one's called Wild in Me. How to recall this wild in me? My toes have forgotten how to grasp. Atrophied feet push pedals deaf to strut of songs from time before. My toes have forgotten how to grasp. This mouthy mind won't let me hear the strut of songs from time before, when hand steps whispered soft as rain. This mouthy mind won't let me hear the time before, this modu roar, when hand steps whispered soft as rain. Each murmur hummed and purred in me. The time before this motor roar, each blade of grass a lilting tongue, each murmur hummed and purred in me. Each color peeled and death was young. Each blade of grass a lilting tongue, teeth wandering from bite to song. Each color peeled and death was young, and life was heaving, mending, gone. Atrophied feet push pedals deaf and charging through explosive truth. There's no such time as time before. But I recalled this wild, this me. I love that poem because it's so much of, I mean, it resonated with me as someone who's thinking about ecological issues. But the question I wanted to ask you is how you as a poet managed to take big concepts and turn them into emotive poems.
Yeah, thanks for the question and the reading, Chris. It to hear you read it is quite beautiful and moving to me, actually. And I've always found that one really difficult to read aloud, by the way. I often choose it for, like, if I'm doing a reading, choose to read that one, and then halfway through I'm like regretting my choice. So the motor roar stuff and the pushing of pedals, and it's there's
motor roar is hard to say.
Yeah, and there's but it's a fun word, and I'm glad I still like
is.
having it in the poem. I guess that's part of the idea, that long R in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has repeating lines as well, which is part of what makes it tricky, right? So yeah, the question is about the relationship between thought and feeling, basically, in ecologically minded or scientifically derived poetry. Um, I don't believe in a firm distinction between thought and feeling. So that's sort of what I'm going with here, I guess, in my approach, is trying to like fold thought into feeling. I'm actually quite a poetic thinker, or an imagistic thinker. So I think in images. I'm not really like, I studied a fair amount of philosophy in my time, but I'm not really a philosophically systematic thinker. I've gradually come to realize. So what I'm usually interested in doing is thinking thoughts that excite me and thoughts that sort of flash in my mind, and to sort of twist them and swivel them. That's what I'm interested in doing, I should say, in this book, in Humanimus. So thinking about the world around me and looking at political situations and looking at ecological devastation and looking at toxicity. There's a large part of this book that deals with oil. There's all kinds of sort of poetic encounters with the toxic, right? And so that's one, and I'm really interested in just trying to mobilize those images as images in a not exactly neutral, but non-didactic way. Use the term didactic. So just to let them sort of linger through and radiate through the text as images, because this is the world we live in. And this toxicity is all around us, and it's we know it well, and we know that it can be beautiful, and we know that it is us to some extent. So yeah, I think with scientific concepts a lot, but I think in light of part of what you're saying about learning through literature and learning through poetry and fiction, I think one of the things that literature can do is to sort of help us see things otherwise, right? So, and to pull us out of our everyday encounters with things. So the way that you're sort of the way that we habitually frame the conversation about science and ecology and climate change is sort of doom and gloom versus optimism, right? So these are the two. Either we can take action, right, and change our lives for the better, or we can just continue to wade blindly into the apocalypse, grab in the last rolls of toilet paper from Costco as we tumble into the abyss, right? But I think literature can help us to see beyond that binary, right? And to see that there's actually a million shades of nuance in between those things. And actually, we need to just also live our daily lives. And yes, this is awful what's happening. And yes, we need to act and we need to change things. But at the same time, we're here, and let's look at the world around us and let's marvel at the world around us. And that's one of the things that I'm interested in doing. And I find the language of science just to be very potent also for poetry. And a lot of the poets that I really like are doing similar things with scientific language and scientific concepts. They can often give you an approach to thinking. Like I'm very much a lay. My interest in science is very lay person interest, but I do love reading nonfiction books about science, and I love sort of the filtered down knowledge of the cosmos and of biology and of chemistry. And there's just so many fascinations that science unearths for us that but that science might not do the best job always of contemplating, right?
But it's a very precise language, which
Yeah.
is, I imagine, useful in poetry as well.
Mhm. Yes, that's true too. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The very precision of the language, and just the things that it unearths for thinking. Yeah, like the language of petroleum, right? And the idea that that petroleum is derived from zooplankton, and from
Mm,
ancient mineral and vegetal life and biological life. That's so fascinating to me, and it's one of the deep fascinations in this book as well.
mm.
Yeah.
Um,
Am I
David, I think we're sort of up against the edge of our
right?
time limit. So maybe what I want to do one more thing regarding your book. So I had written down some of my favorite little phrases that I had underlined. So I want to read some of them. And if you want to say anything about any of these, feel free. They're all very short. Methane rose, say no to the death drive, the unlubed flagpole fang, exhaust scorch, hung to let the others dream. Bovine prophet. I actually wrote a little haiku using the phrase bovine prophet after reading that. Picture a gash in the glut of the world, a man who'd drooled pitch. This is the kind of language a lot of your poems use, like really, they're complex, but they're playful at the same time. They're really interesting and provocative, and a lot of them were kind of like kind of gut punches, and just like, oh wow, like when, and you have whole sections on oil, and I'm just like, and I know a lot about this stuff theoretically, but reading them in poetry was, I think, new to me, and just was like, oh, just pounding in the gut, and like, but powerful and moving. And at the same time, as you said, there's a lot of appreciation of beauty and what's at stake, which is really important. So so I'll just say it was a beautiful read. I really enjoyed reading it. I'll hold it up one more time. David Huebert. Check it out, people. And thank you, David, for making the time. I don't know if you have any final comments or remarks.
Yeah, my last word from the bovine prophet is just to have everyone go out and read A Boy with a Problem, or A Boy with a Problem, excuse me, by Chris Benjamin. It's a really exciting read. It ends with a nice, big, inviting glass of red wine, which was possibly my favorite closing image that I've ever had in a book, because I just went straight to my kitchen and poured myself a glass of red wine. And
Nice.
it has such very memorable and vivid scenes that'll really stick with you. And yeah, to me, it's just short fiction at its best. So yeah, I hope everyone, it's been a pleasure talking with you today, Chris. And I really want to take your workshop actually as well on
All right.
character. So maybe we should end there and say ciao, everybody, and see you, Chris.
All right. Thanks so much, David.